He discovered the bank transfer at 9:47 on a Monday morning. The confirmation sat in his inbox like evidence at a crime scene. $500,000 gone, not stolen, transferred, authorized by his own signature, processed through his own bank, sent to an account that had already been emptied and closed. His secretary stood in his office doorway with the phone records, the hotel receipts, the photographs. Everything was real. Everything was evidence of something that had never actually existed. Marcus Chen had built his real estate empire on the ability to read situations clearly. He could look at a property and see its potential. He could look at a person and see their intentions. He'd survived coming to Los Angeles with $300 by learning to distinguish between who people claimed to be and who they actually were. But this woman, Isabella, or whatever her name was, had somehow managed to be two contradictory things simultaneously. She'd been real and false at the same time, and he'd voluntarily paid $500,000 to spend 4 days in that contradiction. The strange part wasn't that she'd disappeared. The strange part was that he couldn't explain to anyone, not even to himself, exactly what she'd taken from him. The money was just money. But what she'd taken before the money, that was something he'd spent 12 years trying to get back. Let me tell you about Marcus first, because this story isn't really about a con artist. It's about a man who was perfectly set up to be vulnerable to exactly the right kind of lie. It's about what happens when someone builds an empire specifically to avoid ever being vulnerable again, and then meets someone who makes vulnerability feel like the only intelligent choice he's ever made. Marcus arrived in Los Angeles in 1950 at the age of 22. He was Chinese American, which meant certain doors were closed to him automatically. Certain clubs wouldn't have him. Certain neighborhoods wouldn't sell to him. Certain people would look at him and see a threat or a novelty before they saw a person. He could have let that destroy him. Some people did. Instead, it made him ruthless about building something they couldn't take away. He learned to recognize real estate patterns that other people missed. He learned which neighborhoods would gentrify in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. He bought properties that everyone else thought were worthless and held them until they became valuable. By 1962, at 34 years old, he owned 11 commercial properties scattered across Los Angeles. He drove a Jaguar. He ate at the best restaurants. He had money in every sense except the one that actually mattered. What people didn't see, what Marcus himself barely admitted, was that every dollar he made was another layer of protection. Money meant he never had to ask for anything. Money meant he never had to depend on anyone. Money meant he could walk away from any situation that required him to be vulnerable. By the time he was 34, vulnerability felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. He had friends, or people who called themselves that. He had business associates who laughed at his jokes and invited him to parties, but there was always a thin distance between Marcus and everyone else, like he was looking at them through expensive glass. He could see them clearly, but they couldn't quite see him. He'd learned over 12 years that this was the price of safety. The price of never being hurt was never being known. The Cockatoo Club was the kind of place where that distance felt comfortable. It was exclusive enough that everyone there had something to protect. Everyone was watching everyone else. Everyone understood that some conversations were really about something else. It was a place where you could be alone, in a room full of people, and no one would question it. Marcus went there most Friday nights. He'd sit at the bar, nurse a drink that was more about appearance than enjoyment, and watch the room. He liked understanding the patterns of money and power. He liked seeing who was afraid and who was pretending not to be. He never approached women, because approaching women required a kind of hope he'd learned to live without. But on this particular Monday night, and he would later remember this as the moment everything pivoted, though he wouldn't understand why until much later. He wasn't supposed to be at the Cockatoo Club at all. His business partner had called an emergency meeting about a property development deal in Pasadena. The meeting had run late. Marcus had left the office around 9, and instead of driving home to his empty apartment, he'd found himself driving toward the club, toward the familiar distance of a room full of strangers. This was where she was. She sat 2 stools away from him. He noticed her not because she was the most beautiful woman in the room. She wasn't, though she was beautiful, but because she was the only person in the room who looked like she was actually present. Everyone else at the Cockatoo Club was performing. They were performing wealth, performing sophistication, performing the kind of confidence that comes from never having to question your place in the world. But she was just sitting there, looking at people like she was genuinely curious about them. She wore a dark dress that suggested money without announcing it. Her dark hair was styled in the way that required either a very good salon or a very talented woman with a mirror and patience. She sipped something that might have been wine or might have been water, and she seemed completely unbothered by the fact that she was alone. The bartender knew her. Marcus noticed this. The bartender brought her drink without being asked. There was a familiarity there, but not the familiarity of regular customer. It was something else, something more careful. She turned to look at him. Not suddenly. Slowly, the way someone turns when they've sensed they're being watched, and they want to give the watcher time to look away if they're going to. But Marcus didn't look away, and she smiled like she'd expected that. "You're the real estate developer," she said. Not a question, a statement. Marcus felt something shift inside him. She knew who he was. Someone had told her about him. This thought was immediately followed by another thought. He didn't care who had told her. He only cared that she was interested. "That's one of the things I do," he said. "That's the only thing anyone here does," she said. "Build things, accumulate things, protect things. But you seem like you're building something different." This was the moment. This was the precise moment where he should have recognized the con. Because what she'd just done was take a vague observation that he looked different from the other men in the room, and made it sound like she'd seen something about him that no one else saw. She'd made him feel special by making an observation that could apply to anyone, but framing it like it was specifically about him. If he'd been thinking clearly, he would have seen this. But he wasn't thinking clearly. He was thinking with a part of himself that had been starved for 12 years. "What's your name?" he asked. "Isabella," she said. "Isabella Marconi. I'm from Milan originally, but I've been traveling." Her accent was good, not perfect, but good. The kind of accent that suggested Italian heritage, but American education. Later, when he was trying to piece together what was real and what wasn't, he would wonder if she actually was from Italy, if that part was true, if anything was true. But in that moment, her accent just made her more interesting, more foreign. More impossible to categorize according to the rules he understood. She moved 1 stool closer to him. "What's your name?" "Marcus Chen." She repeated his name like it was something she wanted to remember, like it mattered to her that she got it right. "Marcus, that's a good name. Strong, Roman, but you don't feel Roman, if that makes sense. You feel like someone carrying something, like you're stronger than you need to be." This was expert work. What she'd done was observe something true about him, that he did carry something, that he was stronger than circumstances strictly required, and then presented it back to him like it was a quality she admired. She was reflecting him back to himself, but only the parts he wanted to see. She was holding up a mirror that showed him as he wished he was. "What brings you to the Cockatoo Club on a Monday night?" he asked. He was trying to change the subject, to regain control of the conversation, but even as he asked it, he didn't want to know the answer. He wanted her to tell him something that would make her more interesting, more real, more chosen. "I'm here because someone told me I should meet a man named Marcus Chen," she said. "Someone said he was intelligent and lonely, and probably wouldn't believe me if I told him the truth about anything, so I might as well tell him something interesting instead." She was joking. The smile on her face indicated she was joking, but Marcus heard the truth underneath the joke, and he felt something shift inside him. She was saying that she knew what she was doing. She was saying that she understood him well enough to know exactly how to manipulate him, And then she was telling him this explicitly with a smile, like it was charming. In a rational moment, this would have been a warning. This was someone saying, I am about to deceive you, and I'm telling you this in advance, so that when it happens, you'll think you were paying attention. But Marcus wasn't in a rational moment. Marcus was in the moment he'd been avoiding for 12 years, the moment where someone was paying attention to him, and he was paying attention back. Who told you that? He asked. Does it matter? She said. They were right, weren't they? He couldn't argue with this. They had been right. She had told him something that he wanted to believe, and he did believe it. She had set him up perfectly, and he'd walked into it with his eyes open. What do you do? He asked, besides meet lonely men in clubs and tell them things designed to make them feel understood. I'm an art dealer, she said, or I will be, very soon. My family in Milan, we have access to pieces, very valuable pieces, European masterworks that need to be moved, acquired, protected. It's delicate work. It requires people with capital and discretion, people who understand that some things are more valuable than money. She was building the con in real time, and she was doing it so skillfully that he could see exactly what she was doing, and he still wanted to believe it. She was creating a world where having money didn't matter as much as having access to something rare. She was creating a world where he could be useful for something other than his money. She was creating a world where he could be chosen. That sounds complicated, he said. It is, she agreed, which is why I'm looking for someone who can handle complicated things. Someone who understands that the best investments are the ones no one else can see. Someone who wouldn't need to tell anyone about it. This was the hook. This was where she caught him completely, because what she was offering wasn't money or sex or companionship. What she was offering was secrecy. She was offering a world where he could do something that mattered, something that was just between them, something that would make him special in a way that building real estate never could. She was offering him the thing he'd been missing for 12 years, someone who would know him and keep knowing him, because they shared a secret. I should probably go home, Marcus said. You could, Isabella said. Or you could give me your phone number, and I could call you tomorrow and tell you more about this. And you could spend the next 24 hours thinking about whether you want to be the kind of man who walks away from interesting things, or the kind of man who walks toward them. He gave her his phone number. She called him the next morning. They had lunch. She told him more about the art acquisition, and it sounded more plausible than it had the night before. She spoke about specific pieces, a Caravaggio, a Botticelli, things that could theoretically be missing from Italian museums. She spoke about the logistics of moving them, the politics of acquisition, the importance of discretion. And the whole time she was talking, she was watching him like she was measuring how much of this he believed, like she was calibrating the story based on his reactions. What made her a brilliant con artist wasn't that she lied well, it was that she listened well. She could tell when he was skeptical about the Botticelli, so she stopped mentioning specific pieces and started talking about the emotion of acquisition instead. She could tell when he was thinking about the financial aspect, so she shifted to talking about the historical importance of protecting art from being lost. She was always one step ahead of his doubts, always presenting the next piece of information that would make him feel like he understood what was happening. By Wednesday, he was in love with her, not with who she was. He still didn't know who she was. He was in love with the attention she was paying him. He was in love with feeling like he mattered to someone. He was in love with the idea of being the kind of man who understood rare and valuable things. On Thursday, she told him she needed the money, not right away, in the next few days. Her family was ready to make the acquisition, but the window was closing. The pieces were about to be sold to someone else. The opportunity was evaporating. He should have asked questions. He should have asked for documentation, for proof, for any kind of evidence that this acquisition was real. He should have had his lawyer look at the arrangement. He should have done any of the things that the rational version of Marcus Chen would have done. Instead, he said yes. What he didn't say was, "I'm terrified of being alone again. I'm terrified of you leaving." I'm terrified of discovering that the past 4 days were the realest connection I've ever had with another person, and that you were performing the entire time. So yes, I'll give you the money. I'll give you whatever you want. I'll do whatever it takes to make you stay." But that's what he meant. That's what she understood. That's why she'd chosen him. He went to his bank on Friday morning and transferred $500,000 to an account she'd given him. The account was in a different name, a business name, something that suggested legitimacy. He didn't ask questions about why the account was set up that way. He didn't ask questions about anything. That night, they celebrated. They went to an Italian restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. She ordered wine and pasta and told him stories about growing up in Milan. She told him about her mother, who was an art historian. She told him about the summers she spent in Florence. She told him stories that were detailed and specific and probably completely false, but which made him feel like he was getting to know her, like the gap between them was closing. "When the acquisition is complete," she said, "we're going to have so much time together. We're going to be able to do anything we want, go anywhere we want. No one will know about it except us. It will be our secret." He believed this. Or he wanted to believe this so badly that the distinction didn't matter. "How long will you be gone?" he asked. "1 week," she said. "Maybe less. I need to go to Milan to finalize everything, to make sure the pieces are secured and the transfer is complete. And then I'll come back, and we'll have everything." "And then what?" he asked. She reached across the table and took his hand. "And then we figure out who we are when we're not afraid anymore." This should have been his moment of clarity. This should have been when he realized that she'd just said something that described exactly what he'd been trying to avoid for 12 years. But instead, it just made him love her more. She left on Saturday morning. She promised to call. She promised to send word from Milan. She promised to come back. And Marcus believed all of it because he needed to believe it. Hope, at that point, was a necessity rather than an emotion. By Monday morning, he'd stopped believing. His secretary brought him the evidence piece by piece. No hotel registration for Isabella Marconi in Los Angeles. No record of art acquisition in Milan. No indication that anything she'd told him had been true. The police were polite, but unhelpful. She hadn't stolen anything. He'd given it to her. She hadn't made any explicit promises. She'd only implied them. There was nothing they could do. The worst part was how carefully he examined every moment, every conversation, every touch, looking for the exact point where she'd shifted from being a real person to being a con artist. But he couldn't find it. She'd been both things the entire time. She'd been real and false simultaneously. Every moment had been genuine and calculated at the same time. He hired a private investigator. The investigator found records at the hotel where Isabella had been staying. But she hadn't been registered under her real name, and there were others, other men, other wealthy men, all with similar stories. The investigator compiled a file of them. There was Edward, a banker who'd given her $75,000. There was Robert, an oil executive who'd given her $200,000. There was Daniel, a shipping magnate, another $150,000. She'd run the same con on all of them, with variations designed specifically for each man. Marcus sat alone in his apartment reading the file, and he felt something worse than anger. He felt like he was discovering that the realest moments of his life had been the most carefully constructed, that the woman who'd made him feel most understood had understood him as a mark, a target, a mark in a larger pattern of marks. Years passed. Marcus built his real estate empire even larger. He made more money. He acquired more properties. He surrounded himself with more distance. But the money didn't protect him the way he'd thought it would. The isolation didn't keep him safe the way he'd imagined. And sometimes late at night, he would think about Isabella, or whatever her name was, and wonder what she was doing. Wonder if she was running the same con on other men. Wonder if she was alone, the way he was alone. When Marcus was 47 years old, he decided to hire a private investigator again. It took 6 months, but they found her. She was living in San Francisco under the name Elena Rossi. She was living with a man named Thomas Whitmore, a wealthy venture capitalist, old money, the kind of man who would be vulnerable to exactly the kind of attention she specialized in. She was working as an art consultant for a gallery in the Mission District, and according to the investigator's report, she was exactly the kind of woman who would vanish if Thomas Whitmore found out who she really was. But there was something else in the report, something the investigator had added almost as an afterthought. Thomas Whitmore had called the gallery looking for Elena. He'd reported her missing. And when the police found her, she didn't run. She stayed. She talked to Thomas. She told him that she'd been planning to leave, but something had stopped her. She'd realized, somewhere in the middle of building the con, that she was tired of building cons. That what she actually wanted was to see if she could be known by someone without first being needed. The investigator had interviewed Thomas Whitmore. Thomas said that Elena had told him everything. She'd told him about the art acquisition that wasn't real. She'd told him about the men before him. She told him about Marcus Chen, and about Edward the banker, and about Robert the oil executive. She told him that she'd started running cons because she didn't know how to exist in a way that didn't involve performing for other people. That she'd learned, in childhood, that the only way to be chosen was to be exactly what someone else needed. And by the time she was an adult, she couldn't remember how to be anything else. Marcus read this part of the report several times. He read about Eleanor's childhood, about the foster homes, about the rotating cast of caretakers, none of whom had stayed long enough for her to know if they loved her or just needed what she could do for them, about how she'd learned, very young, that the only way to stay in a place was to become essential, and the only way to become essential was to become invisible as yourself and visible as a reflection of what other people wanted. He sat in his apartment, reading about Elena's childhood, and he thought about his own childhood. He thought about his parents, who'd worked so hard to protect him from the world that had rejected them. He thought about how he'd learned, watching them, that the only safe way to exist was to need nothing from anyone. He thought about how, in trying to protect himself from being hurt, he'd made sure no one could ever really know him. And then he thought about those 4 days with Isabella. He thought about how, in those 4 days, he'd been fully known. Someone had looked at him completely and understood what he needed. And yes, it had been a con. Yes, she'd been performing. But in performing for him, she'd given him the only gift that mattered, the gift of being chosen. The investigator asked if Marcus wanted him to do anything with this information. Marcus said no. He said he wanted to send a message to Elena, but nothing more. The message was simple. Thank you for the 4 days. I'm sorry I didn't know you were broken. He never found out if she received it. He never heard from her again. But sometimes, years later, when he was older and had softened enough to admit that isolation was a form of slow death, he would think about Elena and wonder if she'd ever found someone who could stay, someone who could love her for the real version of herself, not the performed version. Someone who understood that all of us are performing all of the time because we're all too afraid to be fully known. The money was gone. The con was irreversible. But what Marcus discovered in the years after was that Isabella had given him something much more valuable than $500,000 could buy. She'd given him evidence of his own capacity to feel. She'd proven to him that he was capable of love, capable of vulnerability, capable of being completely foolish in the pursuit of connection. And maybe, he thought, in the end, that was worth the price. But here's the turnaround. Here's the thing that changes everything. Marcus eventually had the investigator interview Elena directly. Elena agreed to meet with him 13 years after they'd met at the Cockatoo Club. They sat in a coffee shop in San Francisco, and Marcus asked her the question that had haunted him for over a decade. Did you ever, at any point, feel anything real for me? Elena was quiet for a long time, and then she said, I felt real the entire time. That was the problem. I wasn't performing a version of myself that was false. I was performing a version of myself that was true, but I didn't know how to do it without lying about why. I wasn't lying to you about feeling connected to you. I was lying about the art acquisition because I couldn't believe that you would stay if I was just myself, and I couldn't believe that I was worth staying for if I wasn't essential. She told him that she'd conned dozens of men, but she'd never conned any of them about the moment itself. Every kiss was real. Every word of affection was genuine. Every moment of attention was the truest thing about her, because it was the only way she knew how to exist, by being completely present for another person, by making them feel chosen, by being exactly what they needed. So, the money, Marcus started, was the price of 4 days, where I didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what I was in that moment, Eleanor finished. And yes, I spent it. Yes, I used it. But I also kept thinking about you. I kept thinking about the man who was smart enough to see that I was conning him and chose to believe me anyway. I kept thinking about someone choosing vulnerability, even after being told explicitly that they were choosing stupidity. Marcus asked her why she'd stayed with Thomas Whitmore. Why, for the first time, she hadn't run. Because he knew I was conning him, she said, and he loved me anyway. Because he understood that we were both performing for each other, and that was okay. We both wanted to feel chosen so badly that we agreed to choose each other, even knowing it was built on lies. And somewhere in that agreement, something real grew. Marcus left San Francisco that night, and he never saw Eleanor again. But he carried that conversation with him for the rest of his life. He carried the understanding that he and Elena hadn't been conned and con artist. They'd been two people who were so afraid of being truly known that they'd created a world where they could be completely false and completely genuine at the same time. She wasn't stealing from him. She was stealing the feeling of being chosen, the only thing she knew how to take. And he was giving it to her not because she tricked him, but because for 4 days he got to feel like he mattered. He got to feel like his loneliness had been visible to someone and accepted. He got to feel like his need was so valuable that someone would con an empire to fulfill it. The money stayed gone. The con was never reversed. And when Marcus died many years later, he left a significant portion of his real estate empire to a foundation for foster children. He never mentioned Elena in his will, never mentioned the con, never mentioned those 4 days. But everyone who knew him understood that something in him had been fundamentally altered, that he'd learned from a woman who understood deception better than almost anyone, that the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone see that you're lonely, and the most valuable thing you can do is see that someone else is lonely and choose them anyway.